All right, Herle Burlyites, we're back with more content for you this week. It's amazing what we've got for you this week. We've got a return engagement by Paul Palango to talk to us about the mass shootings in Nova Scotia back in 2020, the subject of an inquiry that is going on right now in Nova Scotia. Paul was with us a couple of years ago when the issue was pretty fresh. Paul, as you should know, a long-time award-winning journalist who had retired to rural Nova Scotia to sell blown glass and found himself in the story of a lifetime and has ended up back breaking news all the time on this story. Nobody's following it closer than Paul, and nobody has given us more information about what's really going on in this story than Paul has, and I'm really thrilled that you're back. When you were here last, Paul, well, first of all, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very well. Paul has written a book about this subject that really takes us up to the start of the inquiry. It doesn't cover the inquiry, but it takes us pretty much right up to the start of the inquiry. It's called 22 Murders. It's a hell of a read, Paul. By God, it's a gripping story. You have a copy of it you can show our listeners and viewers here?
There it is.
22 Murders, true crime and public policy at the same time.
If somebody told me a couple of years ago I'd be writing another book about the RCMP, I'd say, you're crazy. It's never going to happen, but it happened.
Right. So when you were here last, we talked about your investigative reporting into the mass shootings in Nova Scotia and what it's revealed. Based on further research, you wrote this book about the subject. Since the publication of your book, the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission, struck by public demand, has held hearings, and I'm hoping you can update us on those developments and also what we've learned and what you've learned since we last spoke. But first, I want to ask you about something that struck me in the book, which is when describing the story of the killer's partner, you referenced that a certain passage of it seemed lifted from the Fellowship of the Ring, from the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. And as a devoted Tolkien fan, I wanted to know, have you watched the new Amazon series?
No, I haven't. I haven't got around to it. Actually, I've been away. So when I travel, I don't watch a lot of things. And I just got back the other day. So
right. I assume you must be a buff if that link was made to you, you must be a buff. And let me tell you, it's fantastic, this prequel on Amazon. By God, it's good. You're going to really enjoy it. Okay, now to serious stuff. Let's start with what we know, because I want to assume that our listeners haven't really heard much about this since we last spoke, because there really hasn't been a lot of news about it other than a political side story about it in central Canada or Western Canada. So let's start with a pithy description of what went down. And as you're doing this, Paul, let's point out where the official version and the facts you have uncovered vary. Okay?
Well, I'll try to do that. That's one of the things I set out to do in the book, is to create a clear narrative of what happened so people understand it. Because when we talked 2 years ago, I said my concern was that a public inquiry would be called and it would try to muddy the facts and make it not clear. And that's exactly what happened. So back in April 18th and 19th, 2020, beginning on a Saturday night, people started being killed in a place called Portapique, Nova Scotia, which is about 20 minutes west-northwest of Truro. And it's on the Bay of Fundy, the Minas Basin. One of the residents there, Gabriel Wortman, ended up killing 13 people, or one could argue allegedly killed 13. He killed most of them. There's some doubt about one of them. And the next day, the RCMP, which were the local police in that area, responded, did not contain the situation, say they thought they had him contained or that he had committed suicide. The next morning, he started killing people in other parts of Nova Scotia and ended up killing 9 more people, including RCMP Constable Heidi Stevenson. Before he was himself killed, and being shot by RCMP officers at the Irving Big Stop, of all places, in Enfield, just north of Halifax Airport. So from the beginning, there was the usual response that, the RCMP did the best they could. It was a terrible situation. They did respond. Eventually, they got their man. And from the beginning, from my point of view, I saw real holes in the story just from day one. Like everything that happened didn't make sense. And so I started.
Well, there almost wasn't a story on day one, was there, Paul? Like, the killings happened on Saturday and Sunday. Is that correct?
Yeah, Saturday night and Sunday morning.
And on Monday, the RCMP held a news conference in which they did not know how many people were dead, whether anybody was injured, or what had happened and where.
Well, they held their first press conference on the Sunday night.
Okay, sorry, that must be the
Sunday night, and then the Monday as well. And I mean, they didn't even have a full list of the number of people dead for 3 or 4 days. And this seemed really odd, but then when you looked at what happened later on, as I started to go through the story, we found that they didn't even discover some of the bodies until 18 hours afterwards. That they said they had gone door to door to evacuate people in the community, but they didn't go door to door. In fact, 5 people were lying dead for 18 hours that they didn't find.
What about the kids in the basement? Tell us about the kids in the basement.
Well, at one point, among the first people, if not the first people he killed, were Jamie and Greg Blair, who lived on Orchard Beach Drive in Portapique. And they had 2 young children with them, 12 and 10 years old. He shot Greg Blair on the porch and then shot and mutilated Jamie Blair inside. The children eventually escaped and ran next door through the woods to neighbor Lisa McCulley's house, who hid them in the basement with her own 2 children, who were also 10 and 12 years old. She went out to decide to investigate, and she too was murdered. And then the children ended up spending more than 3 hours in that basement. And the RCMP said they had the whole thing under containment. They were protecting them, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this was suspicious because, the one thing the RCMP likes to do is if it, rescue people, rescue children, rescue cats in trees, whatever, and publicize their heroic efforts. And what made me suspicious about what happened was the RCMP said nothing about rescuing the kids. And I only learned about the kids days later, probably a week and a half later, because I'm sort of an inveterate reader of obituaries. Some of the best obituaries in the world are in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald. They're so colorful. And so I read all the obituaries. And in Lisa McCulley's obituary, there's a thank you to the 911 operators for staying on the phone for a couple of hours with these children. And I thought, well, what was that about? And that sort of provoked me to continue the investigation.
By the way, you broke a bunch of 911 call records as part of your investigative reporting on this story, and I read them, and I hope to God I never have to call 911. Those read like Kafkaesque or Abbott and Costello routines.
Well, that's what happened. That the more, I began, because the mainstream media would largely accepted the official version of the story, I started to poke around and cobble together sort of my own sort of informal newsroom. It was like, at the Globe and Mail, I used to run all kinds of reporters and do all kinds of stories, but I needed to cobble something together. So I had citizen investigators who were eager to follow this. I became their point man and literally assigned some of them to projects. And then I needed an outlet, and I couldn't find anyone who would publish my stuff. So I went to Frank Magazine, the satirical magazine, and said, I'll cover this for you, but you can't.
It's a publication I have some modest familiarity with from the mid-1990s.
Yeah, well, in Ottawa. Sort of Ottawa and Halifax are 2 different ones. Related but different. And then Frank Magazine, I made a deal with Andrew Douglas that I'll write this stuff for you, but you can't turn it into satire. And so we had this marriage. And then I got a podcaster, Jordan Bonaparte, the Nighttime Podcast, and that became our sort of visual medium. And the other element of this was Rick Howell and Todd Vino, talk show hosts in Halifax. And so I would discuss things on their show, literally fish for stories. And at one point in all those mediums, I said, I need a great Canadian to step forward and help us with this story because they're hiding things. We know they're hiding things and we're going to find them. And someone provided us with, in June 2021, provided us with copies of the 911 tapes from that night, which the RCMP and the government basically had kept under wraps. And those 911 tapes showed that the first three callers to the 911, Jamie Blair at 10:01 said it's Gabriel
Told them
Wortman.
exactly what was going on and who was doing
That's right. Told them exactly. It's Gabriel Wortman dressed as a policeman in a police car.
Yeah.
He shot her son, Alex Blair.
They claim not to know this. They claim not to have known this until the next day when they heard it from the killer's partner.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
The 911 calls disprove that entirely.
Yeah, and then the Alex Blair, 12-year-old, in this, as you said, Kafkaesque conversation with a 911 operator, lays out what happened calmly, coldly, to the point where his mother was shot dead in the house, and the Wortman had started a fire around her head. And he's explaining this all to the 911 operator. And what does the 911 operator say? Fire? Let me put you on to the fire department.
Unreal.
It's just crazy. And then the third caller, Andrew McDonald, was shot at by Wortman on the road just outside that house, just near that house. And he went to the RCMP officer there at 10:26. The first RCMP officer responding and said, it's my neighbor Gabriel dressed as a policeman in a police car. And the RCMP still didn't believe him. So they had three calls in those 25-minute period explaining who did it, what they looked like, and what they were driving. And, in the words of the 911 operator dealing with Alex Blair said he's driving a police car. And the 911 operator says, can you get the license number on that? And the kid is like, his mother's lying dead and on fire in the house. His father is shot 10 times. He had to reach into his father's pocket to get a phone. This is absolutely traumatizing, and the 911 operator is so out of it. It's just mind-boggling. So that's part of the story. Then what comes out later through we break a number of stories and force the Mass Casualty Commission, which began its hearings earlier this year, to deal with some of these issues. And one of the issues that's come up that's quite anomalous in all of this is that those first three calls come from Orchard Beach Drive. And so to understand this, there's two roads, Portapique Beach Road and Orchard Beach Drive. They're about 400 meters apart. And Orchard Beach Drive intersects with Portapique Beach Road near the top, near Highway 2. When the police first respond, even though the first three calls come from Orchard Beach Drive, they go in what they call IARD formation down Portapique Beach Road, they say, and make their way all the way down there for over a kilometer in the dark, under fire, amid all kinds of fires that Gabriel Wortman had set, and then find their way back through the woods in about 21 minutes, if you believe this story. It just defies logic. The first three calls came from Orchard Beach Drive. Why did they not go down Orchard Beach Drive? They said they didn't do that. And that has largely been ignored.
Bizarre lack of bizarre lack of seriousness on that first day, it felt, Paul. I mean, I'm just going to pick out one detail from your book, but, on the Saturday, with a number of people dead, they still hadn't found the shooter, but they assumed he'd committed suicide and everything was in hand, and a number of officers went home for the night at like 6:00.
Well, what has come out through the Mass Casualty Commission in a sort of clumsy way is that no white shirts became involved in this, no sort of supervisors or administrators for the RCMP. So the staff sergeants took over. Some of them had backgrounds in traffic. That was their specialty. One staff sergeant who took command, O'Brien, was legally drunk, operating out of the bedroom of his house, and eventually needed a ride to the station from his wife because he couldn't be.
He'd had 5 rums, and I know what that's like.
He says he had 5 rums. Often after 3, you lose count. It becomes about 5. Okay, we'll settle on 5. So anyway, he was in charge. We had others who were this rotating in charge. They had so-called risk managers who were overruling the incident commanders. It's like incident commanders. It's like no one was in charge. And we showed that on one of the series of tapes that we found, the Pictou County channel, where the archives were kept on Broadcastify in the United States. And we found those, as I lay out in the book, in the weirdest set of circumstances, because a woman in Orangeville, Ontario, 1,200 kilometers away, heard me on the nighttime podcast and remembered something from 9 months earlier. And it turned out everything she remembered was true, because we ended up finding the tapes and showing the debacle that went on with the RCMP that night and the 911 center and everything else. But it's not the kind of thing that both the government or the Mass Casualty Commission seem really interested in delving into, which is disturbing.
So just so people understand this, so 13 people were killed on Saturday, and another 9 people were killed on Sunday, right? And no alert was put out between those 2 events to the public. There were some obscure tweets that weren't clear on what was going on, but no general alert to protect the public was put out. Incompetence or deliberate?
I think it's both. The incompetence of the RCMP in this case, when I started making this case early on, people said, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, et cetera, et cetera. I said, no, the RCMP is incompetent. And that's been shown in report after report for the last 25 years that have been dutifully ignored by the politicians and much of the population, because they don't want to have to deal with this problem. So what happened with the alerts? There is an alert system that most Canadians are aware of. Your cell phone goes off.
Child is missing, you get an alert, right?
But in Nova Scotia, it was never clearly explained actually until 2 days ago what happened. And in 2012, then Staff Sergeant Mark Fury said he was promoting this idea of having and he just said this 2 days ago to the Mass Casualty Commission, that the RCMP should be subscribing to this alert system. And the RCMP refused to do it. And he said, I left the force because I was so upset about this. It was very compelling, except Mark Fury went on to become effectively the Minister of Public Safety in Nova Scotia, in charge of the RCMP during this period before and during the massacres. And what the question they didn't ask him was, why didn't you insist when you were in that position that the RCMP adopt this? Nobody bothered to ask him that question. And it's a big issue because it raises the fundamental problem with the RCMP as a contract police force in the provinces outside Ontario and Quebec. Policing is a provincial matter. All policing, local policing falls under the province. And municipal...
The RCMP don't report to the province.
But the RCMP is a federal police force basically renting itself to the provinces. And the provinces have no say over what the RCMP does. All they do is pay the bill. They can't monitor them. They can't even criticize them. It's all done through the federal government. So this bastardized system, which effectively was implemented in, sort of 1905 with the founding of Alberta and Saskatchewan, continues to this day, although the policing terrain is completely changed. And, the RCMP is basically obsolete in that role and shouldn't be doing that role. And effectively, there's a saying inside the RCMP that Mark Fury, who was a Mountie, had to confront. And that saying is, nobody tells the RCMP what to do. And so he can't tell the RCMP to do this, do that, or anything else. And that's what's become clear through this story, that the RCMP is just resists any sort of criticism or any sort of outside influences, because it sort of firmly believes that it knows the right way when there's evidence across the land showing that it doesn't. I mean, look what happened in Saskatchewan last week.
Yes, I wanted to get to that. I presume you've been paying attention to that. I wanted to get to that, but let's hold on to that for a second. Let's just hold on to that for a second. Herle Burlyites, we've all heard about how unpleasant airports and air travel have been these last few months. Well, I have an announcement. Only I can fix it. Sort of. Via our presenting sponsor, TELUS, I'm taking you on a stress-free trip to Germany, France, the UK, and Sweden from the comfort of your own car seat, couch, and listening device. It's part of our tour of international best practices, countries who are using evidence to create effective policy around how they manage their spectrum. That's the stuff that makes wireless connectivity work. We're picking up on the rural connectivity conversation we started last week. Here's the key question. How do we best incentivize carriers to build in our rural and remote communities? Let me give you a little background. Spectrum licenses are 20 years long in Canada, but many carriers who own the licenses aren't using them to build anything at all. They're just sitting on them, looking to resell the spectrum for enormous profit. They win. Our rural communities lose, because they still don't have high-speed wireless. There are lots of ways to defeat this naked profiteering. In TELUS's view, it starts with government policy based on the use it or lose it principle. In the UK, they employ creative variations of that approach. In the US, they're innovating with a reverse auction idea, which has proven to be an effective tool for funding rural connectivity. France has just granted licenses that require large and explicit numbers of new sites. 25% of them must be located in rural areas, plus ubiquitous coverage on roadways. Germany has imposed shared deployment obligations, which encourages operators to collaborate to ensure coverage. And Sweden has created explicit policy providing coverage to households with no alternative form of internet access. So there's lots of international evidence piling up for what's possible. The models are out there, and TELUS believes government needs to step up to get rural Canadians connected in order to meet their own social policy goals. Next week, we'll wrap up this conversation with a forward-looking announcement on spectrum. Stay tuned. I read your book, and there is no shortage of evidence of incompetence on the part of the RCMP. I was super interested in what you had to say about the number of people killed in service in the RCMP versus other jurisdictions. Super interested in what you had to say about their training with firearms and in acute cases. But when I read your book, to me the story is that you don't believe this is a story of incompetence. You believe there's a cover-up here. You believe something else is going on that we're not intended to know. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. I mean, I firmly believe that. I mean, in the title of this book was written, completed like 15 months ago, the first draft.
Yeah.
And even then, at that early stage, prior to the Mass Casualty Commission, and around the time we first talked, after the time we talked, I write about, the subtitle is Investigating the Massacres, Cover-Up, and obstacles to justice in Nova Scotia. So it was clear to me back then there was a cover-up. And so I basically, put my private parts on the line and said, I'm calling this a cover-up. And the Mass Casualty Commission, the public inquiry, hadn't even sat yet. And then it began sitting earlier this year. And now I have people all over, policemen, law professors, ordinary citizens, politicians, all saying it's a cover-up. And what are they covering up? There appears to be that Wortman and likely people close to him in his circle, had a special relationship with either the RCMP or other police, including the CBSA.
And probably the RCMP, just to be clear, probably the RCMP in New Brunswick, not in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, probably right? The RCMP in New Brunswick, because my sources, and there's wisps of this if you followed the story. It's never really disappeared, this notion. In fact, it gets stronger and stronger, that there were, as I recently reported in Frank magazine, in 2016, Halifax Police and the RCMP in Nova Scotia began an operation called Project Hogwarts, investigating sort of the reemergence of the Hells Angels in the Maritimes into Nova Scotia. And at that time, they were following one Hells Angels nomad named Robin Moulton. And eventually that case sort of went back into New Brunswick, and the New Brunswick RCMP took control of it, shut it down, and then had two separate projects, Project Thunder and Thunderstruck. It's my belief that Wortman and likely people close to him, like an associate, former Hells Angel, Peter Griffin, and possibly others, were involved as a group of informants providing information about this investigation that was going on in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And
him getting busted, and him getting outed somehow is the suspicion about what led to his I'm shooting rampage.
I'm still working on that, and I'm getting closer and closer to that story. And the RCMP has denied this. They say, Gabriel Wortman had no relationship with us. The problem with that is that in one of my original stories in Maclean's about this, we obtained the undercover manual for the RCMP, the operating manual. And the operating manual, like on chapter 3, paragraph 3, says you could never admit, and I'm paraphrasing what they say, you can never admit who an informant or agent is, and that you basically are authorized to lie to everyone but a judge sitting in a properly appointed court. So the RCMP,
let me stop you.
The RCMP will protect an informant even in death. Okay.
Well, is that wrong? I mean, how much are we entitled to know? Like, let's just stop the true crime part of this for a second and talk about public policy for a second. How much are we entitled to know? Are the police allowed to have an undercover operation that they don't tell us about? I would think so.
Yeah, they can, but sometimes it goes bad. And that's one of the things I point out in the book, that I had the good fortune of getting former RCMP Staff Sergeant Gilles Blin to go on the record about the Danny Kane affair. And Danny Kane was an Hells Angels hitman back in the late 90s who killed 11 people, including an 11-year-old boy with a bomb who accidentally was killed when somebody else was being bombed. And Gilles Blin's involvement he'd stopped Kane, who was on his way to kill an ex-Hells Angel in Halifax at one point. And after the killing, Kane was arrested, Blin went to court, Kane was exonerated. And it turned out afterwards, like this sham of a court case got Kane exonerated. And only after Kane went back to Quebec and the Sûreté de Quebec got a hold of him, did they break the story and find the truth that Danny Kane actually was an RCMP paid informant while he was killing the 11 people. So there's a public policy issue there. And the RCMP desperately wanted to cover that up and not admit it until it came out.
Right.
And so it's well within the realm of possibility that this is exactly what's going on with Wortman or the people closely associated with him. The RCMP has done everything, and the government has done everything to really distort and make confusing what actually happened. There's no clear narrative even coming out of the Mass Casualty Commission. And so for the casual observer, they're trying to figure out what is going on here. And that's what I keep trying to do, is just keep the focus on the real, what's real and what's not real.
Like, there's some decisions that might have been incompetence, but then there's others that are really curious in the context of your belief that there's a cover-up going on. And, one of the things that has always struck me is the fact that they wanted no help from other police forces. And so, for example, as you detail in the book, they believe, incorrectly as it turns out, that the killer is speeding toward Truro. And he's probably killed 20 people at this point. They've not been able to find him. But they think he's on the way to Truro, and they're on the phone with the Truro police. And the Truro police are like, do you want us to do anything? And the cops are like, no. And the RCMP are like, no. We have this underhand. Please stay out of it. Don't block the road. Don't intercept anybody. Stay out of it. Why would they do that?
Well, one of the things in the RCMP undercover manual says, if an operation is goes bad, deal with it yourself. Don't call in other police forces. Because if you bring in another police force, what's that going to do? It's opening up an investigative avenue that could be explored. So the other police force is going to be compelled to find the truth. So they keep the other police force out. And it's good that you pointed that out, because what they did is they never got in front of Wortman, but they were following him. And it appears evident to me that the people who were following him, certain designated officers, were assigned to kill him. And how do we know this? Well, there was an infamous...
Because they were shooting at everybody. Everybody they thought was Wortman, they were shooting at him.
Yeah, they were shooting at him. But, if you look at what happened at the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall, in the official police oversight, the Serious Incident Response Team, who are supposedly the police watchdog, run by then director Felix Caccione, a former judge, he found, the police, this is after Wortman had killed the 19 people. He said two policemen were driving east on Highway 2, and they came across a police car parked at the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall, and they got out and they ordered the policeman to put his hands up, and nothing happened. They started shooting at him, inflicted all kinds of damage, shot up bullets went through the fire hall wall, hit the fire truck, almost hit some of the people who were inside who were being protected from Wortman. And after this incident, it's quite clear that they were going to say the plan was that Wortman was the one who shot up the fire hall. However, a neighbor, Sharon McClellan, saw it all.
Watched the whole thing happen.
Yeah, she watched it all happen. And later that afternoon, went over to bring coffee and cookies to the police and firefighters over at the fire hall. And the police officer, the RCMP officer, Dave Gagnon, said, "You saw what happened? Oh, that changes everything." And if you go back and investigate that shoot up, it's not how CERT said it happened, because I could never figure out how the sign to the west of the station got hit by a bullet and destroyed, an LED sign. Well, Sharon McClellan and other neighbors said the car stopped before the sign. And if it stopped before the sign, you couldn't just happen to see that police car because of the way the terrain. You had to go past that sign to see that police car. So they knew the police car was there, and they tried shooting through the sign like snipers. And this was covered up by the Serious Incident Response Team and Felix Caccione. Well, what's the other interesting connection with Caccione? He was the judge in the Danny Kane case, where Danny Kane years earlier was let off and his whole secret as an RCMP informer was protected. So we have Caccione in two spots where the RCMP is protected. And he is no longer a director. He's now retired after I've done enough stories on him and gone to ground. We haven't heard from him, but I'd love to hear him testify someday about how he came to his decisions.
So, faithful listeners know I've spent a lot of time here in the past several weeks talking about this year's grain crop and the determination of our sponsor, CN, to get it to market safely and on time. To use President Biden's famous phrase, it's a big effing deal. Sorry, Herle Burlyites, we might enjoy cursing on this podcast, but our sponsors still insist on dignity and decorum. Anyway, there's nothing more important to the economy of Canada's heartland than grain. And our farmers depend on the railway to get it to their customers. Big responsibility. So it's with some pleasure that I can report here that 7 weeks into the season, grain movement is strong and smooth. And CN, which has already handled more than 1 million metric tons, is clearing orders on schedule, delivering grain to markets in North America and to seaports for shipment abroad. Actually, grain traffic was down slightly in August as Canadian agriculture shook off the lingering effects of last year's drought. But it's roaring back. Statistics Canada just released new estimates based on satellite imagery and is now predicting the total crop this year will reach roughly 75 million tons. For the sake of comparison, last year's drought-stricken crop was 49 million, so things are well back to normal. As you can imagine, moving that much grain requires some pretty sophisticated planning. CN stays in close touch with shippers, constantly sharpening forecasts, and has been working flat out, making sure its thousands of grain hopper cars are fully inspected and ready to take on the cargo load. Already this month, the expected ramp-up is happening. It will continue till spring. CN wants to be clear. Barring catastrophic weather events, which are out of everyone's control, the railway will move Canada's grain to market. If orders surge, so will CN. The crop is precious to so many people, from farmers to shippers to consumers around the world. There is no more important job. So, out in Saskatchewan, after the stabbing tragedy of a couple of weeks ago, which has horribly disappeared from the news cycle in Canada, huge story in and of itself, but the suspect, Miles Sanderson, died shortly after going into police custody. Did that surprise you?
Well, who knows what happened? I mean, but it's very similar to what happened to Wortman. You know, they both announced it the same way. Everything is fine. The suspect is in custody. That's what they said about Wortman. They'd actually shot Wortman 23 times, or they say. And he was lying handcuffed on the handcuffed on the on the pavement at the Irving Big Stop. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 hours later I said, he's dead. We forgot to tell you he's dead. Well, the same thing happened in Saskatchewan. He's in custody. Whoops, he died. And they're suggesting that he took an overdose or something like that. We don't know. But the parallels.
But in Wortman's case, it was an execution. Let's not confuse the two. I probably shouldn't have done that, but it just was interesting to me. But in Wortman's case, it was a clear execution.
Yeah, they did not that.
They did not attempt to apprehend Wortman.
No. In fact, one of the things that I uncovered was at Frank Magazine, we after the Mass Casualty Commission gave its view of what happened at Enfield Big Stop, it would not provide the security videotapes. And we got some of the security videotapes and lobbied to have the others released. And they said, this whole, according to Caccione and the commission and the officers who testified, there was this long dance where they came accidentally across Wortman in a car they didn't know he was in, and they eventually identified him. And one constable says to the other, Benny, it's him. Blah, blah, blah. They pulled their guns. Drop your gun. He had Heidi Stevenson's service revolver. All of this is in the evidence. But then when we finally got the videos, it showed all of this happened in less than 6 seconds, probably 5-point-something seconds, from the moment that their vehicle stops to the first shot being fired. Not possible. It's just not possible. But the thing, David, that's really interesting here is the day those tapes came out and the Mass Casualty Commission was forced to release those tapes and show what was happening. What happened? Andrew Douglas from Frank Magazine and I were joking. They've been stalling. What are they going to do? What trick are they going to use to deflect attention away from all of this? And what trick did they use? You should know it. The day they released the tapes, what was the trick?
I can't remember. Don't remind me.
Brenda Lucki politically interfered in the investigation.
Okay, so that's where that fits in. That's where that fits in.
The very day that came out. The very day.
Okay, interesting.
Which was a nothing burger. You know, it's like.
Do you consider that a significant story, Paul?
No, I never considered it a significant story.
And you considered it an RCMP diversion tactic?
Or a Government of Canada, Attorney General's Office, Department of Justice deflection.
Okay, but the guy that's really leveled this accusation is Campbell. And he's an interesting character in your book. So tell us a little bit about who he is.
Well, Campbell is a dyed-in-the-wool Mountie who, from BC. He came from New Brunswick. Actually, Campbell went to the University of New Brunswick at the same time as Wortman. We don't know if they knew each other, but it's just an interesting little factoid. But Campbell spent his career out west. His wife was Catherine Galliford, who used to be a spokesperson for the RCMP in BC and well-regarded. Eventually, she complained about harassment and things like that. And she was in the forefront of the harassment movement inside the RCMP and the lawsuits. And then Galliford and Campbell's son was eventually convicted of a murder and imprisoned. He's serving a life sentence right now. Their marriage broke up. Campbell got shifted to Nova Scotia. Prior to that, he went to Ottawa as Staff Sergeant Major. So he was the the protector of all Mountie things. So he's like the Mountie of Mounties. I call him the chief Kool-Aid dispenser. He was inducted into the RCMP by his father. He created an insignia, a lapel insignia. I call it the nepotism insignia, showing that you're a multi-generational Mountie. So anyone wants to mess with you inside the force, they have to realize that you have family in the Mounties. So this is like the Mounties actually proudly display their nepotism, and Campbell thought it was a good idea to have one of these insignias. So he's a defender of the Mounties. Brenda Lucki is not seen as a competent leader inside the force. And she isn't a competent leader. I mean, she was chosen for political reasons over operational reasons. I mean, she's a person who's risen through the ranks of the force as an administrator. One of the problems
if I could just say, Paul, there's nothing in your book that suggests that there was a wealth of qualified applicants for that operation.
No, there isn't. No. She was number 5 or 6 on the list, but she was chosen mainly because Prime Minister Trudeau wanted someone who would tell him what he wanted to hear. I'm going to give you more diversity in the force, and we're going to implement restorative justice principles and all of these things when their job should be running federal police, not being and doing the best possible job operationally, which they're failing at right across the board. So,
I just want to take a quick detour on Wortman, by the way, because, I'll bring this right home to my listeners, many of whom are Laurentian elites who do a lot of travel. Wortman, who had a stockpile of guns and grenades and who had been in a series of bad financial arrangements with friends and family, and who had previous run-ins with the law, had a Nexus pass. How the hell did he get a Nexus pass?
Well, that's exactly it. It raises the question of him being an informant. As I said early on, who was he working for if he was an agent or informant? I added the CBSA. the Canadian Border Security Agency, because there's no way to explain how he had a Nexus pass and was able to smuggle things across the border with regularity, including cases of grenades. And why would you have cases of grenades? Who's your market for grenades in Canada? It's easy. Bikers. So when I say that there's some relationship here, and there appears to be some relationship, the RCMP says, no. It's not believable. Their denials are not believable. And, I'm going to keep pressing on, because the other interesting thing about that, David, is that the Mass Casualty Commission called no one from the CBSA to explain this, which I think is important. Like, how did he have a Nexus pass? How did he cross the border all these times? How did he smuggle across sniper rifles? When was he detained and why? Because there is one or two times he was sort of stopped that are curious, but no explanation is given. It's all very curious that there is something really untoward going on there, especially when you look at the fact that his gardener, Peter Griffin, who was never called as a witness and has since disappeared, was arrested in 2014 in Edmonton for drug trafficking, weapons, and other things, and was linked to the Hells Angels and MS-13, the notorious El Salvadoran street gang, Ruthless. And he was paroled early and back to Portapique and was working with Wortman. Suspicious? Yeah. And Wortman, the last point on this was, on the night of, on April 18th, we talked about the 3 kids being trapped for 3 hours in the basement of Lisa McCauley's house. Who got rescued by the RCMP before the 3 kids? Peter Griffin.
Friend and ally.
Peter Griffin, ex-con, ex-Hells Angel, MS-13, and his parents, who lived just down the road from Wortman.
Who've never said a word about this, have they?
No, they haven't said anything. No boo, no nothing about it. So why do I and others continue to be suspicious? I think there's reasonable grounds for that.
So let's go to one of the most controversial aspects of this. And if I might say, you're in a somewhat sensitive position. Wortman's partner in life, 20-year partner in life, has been portrayed in the official story as a victim of domestic abuse, who's a victim in this story, narrowly escaped death herself by hiding in the woods overnight. That's a pretty compelling story if true, but you don't believe it to be true. And you're taking some grief about that. Why don't you tell us what the story is?
I haven't taken a lot of grief. I've taken grief from mainstream journalists who refuse to cover the story. I mean, Lisa Banfield's story is that there was a party, a virtual party with a couple in Maine. Things got out of hand. There was a fight.
FBI said that party never existed, right?
Yeah, FBI said they found no evidence of that party. She was dragged out of bed, forced to dress, ripped off her shoes. Wortman beat her, shot at her. She, with no shoes or mitts or coat, she hid in the woods, escaped from Wortman, hid in the woods all night at 0 degrees Celsius temperatures for 8 hours. Not possible.
Hypothermia minimum, right?
And scratches and cuts. The woods there are impassable. And she was barefooted. And she said she hid in the root of a tree hollow. The hollow of a tree root, I should say, which I said was the Harry Potter reference. Or
no, Lord of the Rings. Jesus, Murphy, get this right.
Lord of the Rings reference. And
let's not bring J.K. Rowling into this yet.
Yeah. And then she went... And then she says at 6:30 in the morning, just as the police are sent home, she emerges from the woods and all beaten and battered. But the RCMP says the official story, she was beaten to within an inch of her life. But I uncovered information to obtain a search warrant. they had redacted one word for almost a year. And the one word was her injuries were minor. So it didn't really, the story didn't fit. And then I subsequently uncovered information that in two previous small claims court appearances, one before she met Wortman and one after she met Wortman, she lied and provided false evidence at those cases. And the false evidence in the second case was spectacular. The issue was over a ring, and I won't get into the details of that. But since the book was published, I found this other piece of evidence to nail that story. That as evidence of the value of the ring, she proffered to the court a receipt showing that Gabriel Wortman had purchased the ring for $9,000 from his ex-lawyer, Tom Evans. And it was signed and dated. Unfortunately, Mr. Evans had died 113 days before the signing and the dating of the receipt. The case was thrown out of court, but the fact is she offered false evidence. So there's questions right, from the get-go about her veracity and about what she's really doing. Then looking at the behavior of the RCMP and the MCC and the Department of Justice in protecting and coddling her has been very interesting. Because when she finally did testify a month and a half ago, lawyers were not allowed to cross-examine her. She told a very thin story with, some, as one of the lawyers pointed out to me, did you notice that when she cried with her mouth, not her eyes? It looked all rehearsed. And nobody was allowed to ask her any questions about what really happened. How did she survive that night? That part was conveniently ignored. We have her leaving, going to the woods, and 8 hours later coming out of the woods. Doesn't make sense.
Right.
So it's a cover up. And if people are giving me grief, last point, people say, "Oh, you're getting grief for taking on her victimhood." I'm not here to be influenced by victims. I'm here for two reasons, David: to get justice for the dead people and hold the police and the government accountable for what they did and didn't do. And if you don't like
because you're bored, and because you're bored of blowing glass.
Correction. I fuse glass. I don't blow glass. I melt it. No, I wasn't bored at all. I just felt compelled.
I'm just joking.
I just felt compelled that I had to do something because the state of the media, as I got into this story, I saw how all this wokeism and cancel culture affects the investigation. Like what should be a unpartial, nonpartisan investigation. The facts are the facts. Was being influenced by preconceptions. Lisa, as one reporter told me, you can't write about Lisa Banfield. She's a victim. I said, well, prove it. Well, she says she's a victim. The police said she's a victim. Prove it. When I write things, I had one reporter said to me, well, the police didn't say that. And I said, well, the police have been lying. I've showed the police have been lying from the beginning. But this sort of over-reliance on officialdom and official sources for stories has created, I'm the first person in the world who decried the Donald Trump extreme right-wing rally cry of fake news in the media. But then I started covering this story and I'm saying, holy shit, a lot of what they're writing is just fake. They're just accepting what officials tell them and not challenging it. It's the state. It really made my heart sink about the state of the media in this country.
Well, let's try to dig into that just a little bit because you rely, you have a lot of documentary evidence, so I'm not trying to dismiss your evidence, but you also do rely heavily on a witness, Leon Jodry. I don't know if I'm saying his name right.
Yep.
That you can't get the police or other journalists to take seriously. Why do you take him seriously?
Because I and others, part of our whole consortium, I've interviewed him dozens of times, and his story has never changed. And his story makes sense. Lisa Banfield came to his door around 6:30 in the morning. He says, when she went to come to him, he says, "What are you doing here?" And she says, "Oh, Gabriel went crazy." And he says, "Well, why are you coming here? Gabriel doesn't like me." He says, "Oh, I'll leave." Right there. Why would somebody who says she's running from a killer, doesn't know where the killer is, who's been outside freezing for 8 hours, say, "Oh, sorry, I'm going to be polite, I'll leave," and go back into the woods, rather than seek shelter of a guy who has lots of guns and knows how to use them? Didn't make sense. He says there was nothing wrong with her. There were no bruises on her. She wasn't dirty. He was a woodsman. He lived there. He said there's no way she was in the woods.
She was wearing a yoga suit?
She was wearing yoga pants and a spandex top. And that was it. And he said her makeup looked fresh. So he says, I didn't see any of the things she said she said was there. Then when he called 911, the RCMP came, like we're there within 3 minutes. They took her away, did not search his property, did not search to see if Wortman was around there. Just, "Oh, it's all right, see you later. Thank you." Very suspicious in the way they handled that. It's like they knew that she was there. And this was all part of the game of making her story. That's what it looks like. And that's never been refuted. And Leon Jodry has been totally ignored.
Has the commission called him?
No, they didn't call him as a witness.
Why not?
Well, they haven't called anyone who was close to Wortman or were part of those last few days. Peter Griffin wasn't called, who was working and talking to them on the day it happened. You think he'd be a guy they'd want to talk to. He's the guy who put the decals on the car and turned the decommissioned police car into a replica police car. Not called. So there's 16 people in that group who weren't called. Jodry wasn't called. It's incredible. And I mean, this even went down to, in the book I point out, at one point people complained to Global News about their coverage of Lisa Banfield, saying Leon Jodry has a different view of the story. And he told them that during his interview. And they left all of that out of his interview about his suspicions about Banfield's story. And Global put on its website.
And then, is that fear? Is that media being afraid of being on the wrong side of a domestic abuse story?
Probably. Yeah. They're scared of that, and they're scared of making a mistake. So, what they said on their website before taking it down was, well, the police have another version of the story, and we had to go with the police version. So they would not contradict. They even put it in writing, and we were able to capture that before they made it disappear. That this is their mindset. And the whole thing, David, about domestic violence and wokeism. I mean, at one point I had a reporter tell me, "Oh, you don't want to write about Lisa Banfield because women are going to come down to your store in Chester or your house and protest." I said, what is this? The world according to Garp? All these Ellen Jamesians are going to come marching down the road with their tongues cut out, all for a wrong-headed reason that they thought Ellen Jamesian this happened, Ellen James had this happen to her, when Ellen James denied any of what they were doing, and in John Irving's book. So I said, no, I'm not afraid of it. I'm just here to tell the truth and hold the police accountable. And I will not be politicized. So I'm dealing with reporters and journalists who have allowed themselves to become politicized, who are convinced they're being objective and who make no effort whatsoever to be controversial. I mean, what we've seen over the years, David, in journalism is there's no cogent analysis of these kinds of stories anymore. There's no Christy Blatchford-like tenacity going into stories and telling something that defies the official narrative. None of that's going on. It's all official
Journalists
narrative.
don't have the time to do that anymore, though, either, do they? Like, nobody's been, no organization would have dedicated somebody to spend as much time on this as you have.
No, and why not, though? I see the organizations filled with dross. They're like the RCMP itself. they're trying to do everything and they're doing nothing. You know, if I was running this operation, I would, and covering this, I would do what I did at the Globe and Mail back in the late 80s. I would assign a reporter or two and just sacrifice other things till I got to the bottom of the story, you know, and just make it a compelling story and get to the bottom of it. But, you know, right now the media has an attention span of 3 or 4 days. That's it. Like, they want to sum everything up in complete stories, in 1, 2, 3 stories max. Let's move on. We plowed that field when they barely scratched the surface.
So there's something I really don't understand. And so I was reading up on the commission in preparation for this interview, and my understanding is that Lisa Banfield was only questioned by commission counsel. There was no, as you said, no cross-examination by victims' lawyers or anything allowed of her. But that's also true of several RCMP officers who were in charge of what was going on over those 2 days in Nova Scotia. They're also not subject to cross-examination. Now, I don't really know whether that's common practice or not at an inquiry like this, but the inquiry went through several permutations at the beginning, as they tried to have a very limited inquiry into this, and public demand for the truth forced them into this judicial inquiry process. So then why would the judicial inquiry compromise itself in a way that it is clearly not going to reassure Nova Scotians that it has gotten to the bottom of this? Because that was its purpose. That was its point.
David, cover up and obstacles to justice in Nova Scotia. I wrote this before the inquiry because I could see what the inquiry was going to do based on my analysis of other inquiries in the past. In this inquiry, they've done sort of twisted themselves in knots to using the notion of being trauma-informed. We do not want to traumatize people. They also don't want to lay blame on anyone. And what they've done with Banfield and the specific officers that you've talked to...
I just want to stop you. What they're saying is those officers would be traumatized by having to seriously relive the experience.
Yeah, that's right. This is their trauma. So what they've done, if you look at it carefully, by eliminating Banfield, the officers at Onslow Belmont had the same protection. The officers who shot Wertman had the same protection. And a few others had that protection. These are the people at the key intersections that revealed the story, the true story. You know, Peter Griffin doesn't even testify. Banfield is given limited, she tells a story. She doesn't really testify. She's not challenged in any way. Same thing happens at Onslow Belmont. Same thing happens at Enfield. That these are the key intersections where the cover-up is being conducted. Everything else is just basically floating around and doesn't really touch on the key nerve centers. Plus, the other thing that's happened in this inquiry is they've never addressed the criminal connections between Wertman and, well, that Wertman had with criminals, organized crime people, and where his money comes from. Even when they do a forensic accounting of his money, it's like, oh, well, we don't know where that came from. Let's move on. It's just, that's why I thought it would be a cover-up. That's why I'm convinced it is a cover-up, and I'll probably end up writing another book about the cover-up.
But they're going to leave Nova Scotians, are they not, with one of two choices to conclude. Either they are lying about what happened, and therefore you can't trust them, or they're so incompetent, there's no way they can continue to be the police force in Nova Scotia. Like, what are the other two? What other conclusion could you draw?
That's basically it. They're both right. I mean, you're looking at they're lying to protect their franchise and the myth of the RCMP. You know, unfortunately in Canada, you know, like just about anywhere, I mean, we have too many people and far too many politicians who don't want to deal with the hard issue of modernizing police. I'm not talking about defunding the police. I'm talking about making the police, organizing the police in such a way that can deal with the modern realities that we face. Last night I had a call out of the blue from a former municipal police chief and who's a former head of the longtime head of the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs. For more than an hour, he went on. He said, "I have to tell you this, that the Mass Casualty Commission has not analyzed the most important thing here." And it's exactly what I've just talked about, the organization of police. How the RCMP, the system we have now where Ontario and Quebec have their own provincial police and are self-contained, and the RCMP operates as a federal police force, is close to the way things should operate. But in the rest of the provinces, it's all skewed because there's no tiered policing. The RCMP is operating at 3 levels at once, and they're not organized to deal with the modern realities, cybercrime, the vastness of organized crime and the interjurisdictionality of this. The RCMP is completely out of their depths dealing with this, and we need to rethink that. But politicians don't want to deal with it. It's too hard. We don't want to deal with, the RCMP is the national symbol of Canada. Well, for Christ's sakes, the beaver is a national symbol of Canada too. It's a rodent. But if that rodent was, it was creating dams that were drowning out our towns, we deal with the rodent. But we got to deal with the RCMP. And I think that's happening right now. Like the last part of it is, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and other places are seriously, BC, an all-party committee, has recommended getting rid of the RCMP as provincial police. This is modern thinking. It's not being, it's getting rid of an anachronism and forcing the country to reshape itself in a modern way to deal with modern issues.
Well, where are you at the RCMP? Scrap it or reform it in terms of a policing operation? I mean, they do a lot of things other than policing, but as a policing operation.
Well, they shouldn't be doing, they should be a federal police force. Strictly a federal police force, and they shouldn't be polluted by all the other things they do. You have people coming up in the RCMP who work their whole careers in protective services, for example, guarding Parliament Hill, gaining seniority, and then taking over operations in the province. Doesn't make sense. They're not policemen. They're security guards. So that's what they should be. Those should be separate entities, and the RCMP should be a pure entity dedicated to federal crimes and federal oversight.
Time has just flown by on us, Paul, but I've got a couple of more questions for you, and one of which is I'm just going to put to you directly. You've been accused of being a conspiracy theorist because you have a different theory than what is the officially rendered version, and you're relying on sources that are different from what the official version is relying on. How do you refute that? What separates you from somebody who spends 2 years on the internet compiling facts from a variety of different sources and concludes that a species of reptiles has overtaken the earth?
I actually do the legwork. I go out, I talk to people, but I also have, 30 years experience in this. I've written 3 previous books on the RCMP. I know how the force operates and thinks, and I've seen in the past how the system works to protect the RCMP. So I have a bit of a leg up. So when I write a book that, last year before the Mass Casualty Commission comes out, I write, it's a cover up and there are obstacles, obvious obstacles. It all came true. Why did it come true? Because I know what I'm talking about. I'm not guessing, and I talk to credible sources. One guy I had, David, call me early on in this, was a former deputy commissioner of the RCMP. And he phoned me, this is back in May 2020. He said, I've read all 3 of your books and I've hated you for 25 years. But now I've come to realize you're right and I'm going to help you. He says the RCMP has to be taken apart and rebuilt. And I've got that time and time, like the police chief yesterday, same thing. I have credible police sources and government sources. And the thing is, I know the police are lying to me. I know the government is lying and trying to manipulate me. Why would I cover what they're saying until they prove their bona fides? But the mass media says, well, we're not conspiracy theorists. We'll just report what we're told to report. It's incredible, you know? I made a T-shirt. I don't have it here right now. It said, after we got the 911 tapes and proved that they were lying, we had a T-shirt with a tinfoil hat saying, I'm a conspiracy theorist and I can prove it.
Speaking of merch, you can look forward to your Herle Burly shirt in the mail. I have one last question for you, and it's kind of a heavy one. It's a little it's not. I don't want you to answer this just specifically related to this incident, but I'm sure this is something that you've reflected on a lot. So it's just recently the anniversary of 9/11, and I've been watching some recaps and, quite captured by the incredible heroism of the firefighters running into the danger zone up the stairs to try to save people in those two towers. Nobody, with the possible exception of the people that shot Wortman at the Irving gas station, nobody at any point did anything in this Portapique massacre no RCMP officer deliberately put themselves in harm's way to save anybody else at any point. That's also the case in that school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. What should we be expecting of police officers? What in these kind of situations, are we expecting them to sacrifice their lives?
That's their job. It's a shitty thing, but that's their job. And what has happened over the years, I talked about this back in the late 90s in my book, The Last Guardians, that the whole notion of bravery and heroism has been bred out of policemen. It's now all about job safety and protection and trauma and stress. And so now you have these guys who are basically there for the money. They're there for the benefits and not for doing the thing that has to be done. There certainly are officers there who want to do that. In Portapique, there were officers like Tim Mills and others who wanted to do it, to go after Wortman, who wanted to take a risk, who wanted to protect people, and they were stopped by the system because, this is a health and safety issue. We've forgotten largely who the police are and what the police need to be. And so we bred heroism out of them. And then in journalists, we bred instinct out of them. So we have all of these reporters who are just the same, not brave, not courageous, only want to hear official sources and never take a risk. I've recently been through things in this, I know what I'm getting to. I'm not a cop. I'm a journalist. But I've always been keenly aware of how dangerous that can be doing the kinds of stories I do. And I come to terms with that. I was recently threatened. My life was threatened recently. And I'm going to write about that probably in the next book. But it's part of the territory. That's what we deal with. If you're going to tell the truth and tell the stories, then there's going to be some risk. I'm prepared to take the risk, but far too many people are afraid of risk. They want it all handed to them, and they're all looking, I'll do that once I got my pension safely secured. I don't have a pension. I don't have benefits. I haven't had them for 30 years. I live by my wits and hard work. And that's what I do, and that's what I'd expect others to do if they want respect.
All right. Paul, thanks for doing this. If people want to continue to follow this story through your eyes, you are writing for Frank Magazine, and that's available online, correct?
It may not be around much longer. That's another story.
Oh, okay.
The nighttime right now, the nighttime podcast with Jordan Bonaparte, Sunday nights live on YouTube and on the Global Network, radio network at other times.
Okay. So thanks for coming on. I just want to end with a couple things about your book that I take some issue with. One of which is that I am not powerful or important or close to power in any respect. So you mistake me for somebody else. And the second thing is that I hope in the second edition you will revise the reference to the fact you never heard from me again.
Well, thank you for getting back to me. There we are. And maybe someday we can sit down and I can talk about what we were going to talk about back then, Anne McClellan, and because it was important in explaining, because Anne McClellan was first appointed to this commission. And what I wanted to talk about was the roots of my suspicions about what was going to happen here based on a previous commission, the O'Connor Commission and Meher Arar, and what I found there, which informed me about what was going to happen here.
All right. Well, let's have a chat offline about that, and we'll see where it goes. But this has been absolutely fascinating. And as a Canadian, I want to thank you for your service in uncovering this. I know you've done it essentially for no money other than what you get from the book. So essentially no money. And it is a real public service because there's sure is something weird going on here. Thanks for coming on.
Stay tuned.
I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank everybody who watched or listened to this podcast, the Air Quotes team that supports me, and of course, award-winning journalist Paul Palango for, Jesus, what a story. Thanks.
Thank you.